The late afternoon sun cast long golden shadows across the family's modest two-story home in the Lakewood neighborhood of Denver. Maria stood at the kitchen window, watching her 3-year-old daughter Emma play in the backyard with her stuffed rabbit, Mr. Whiskers. It was March 15th, a Tuesday that would forever serve as a demarcation line in their lives, before and after. But on that ordinary afternoon, Maria had no way of knowing what fate had in store for her small family. Emma was humming a melody from her favorite children's show, her pigtails bouncing as she made the rabbit dance through the grass. She was a happy child, full of the uninhibited joy that only the very young possess. Maria smiled, taking a moment to appreciate the simple perfection of the scene. These were the moments she treasured most, quiet afternoons at home, nothing extraordinary happening, just the everyday miracle of watching her daughter grow up healthy and safe. Emma had always been precocious for her age, speaking in full sentences by 2 years old and possessing an empathetic nature that seemed almost unusual for a toddler. She would comfort her mother when Maria had a headache, patting her arm gently and asking, "Mama, feel better soon." At 5:47 p.m., Maria called Emma inside. The evening routine was about to begin. Dinner was already simmering on the stove, homemade chicken and rice, Emma's favorite. Maria had prepared it earlier that day, a comfort meal she made every Tuesday. She drew a warm bath for Emma while the child played with her toy boats and rubber duckies, squealing with delight as the water sloshed over the tub's edge. After bath time came the bedtime ritual, fresh pajamas with cartoon characters, 2 stories, and 3 songs. Emma insisted on exactly 3 songs, no more, no less. Tonight she requested Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star, Mary Had a Little Lamb, and You Are My Sunshine. Maria, with a mother's patient love, singing each note with genuine affection. By 8:30 p.m., Emma was tucked into her little bed, surrounded by stuffed animals and her treasured blanket, the soft pink one with the satin edge that she would fondle absently until sleep her. Maria watched her daughter's breathing slow and deepen, that blessed moment when a child's body finally surrendered to exhaustion. She softly closed Emma's bedroom door, leaving it open just a crack and the hallway light on, exactly as her daughter preferred. Maria made herself a cup of chamomile tea and settled onto the living room couch with her laptop. She had work to do, spreadsheets and client reports for the marketing firm where she worked as a part-time consultant. Being a single mother meant she worked whenever and wherever she could. The house was quiet except for the gentle hum of the refrigerator and the occasional car passing on the street outside. She'd been working for about an hour when she heard it, the unmistakable sound of breaking glass from the back of the house. Her heart skipped a beat. The sound seemed impossibly loud in the quiet evening. Maria's first thought was that something had fallen, perhaps a window blown open by the wind. But there had been no wind that evening. She stood, her laptop sliding off her lap, and walked toward the back hallway. That's when she heard it, the definite sound of a door opening, followed by heavy footsteps in the kitchen. Every maternal instinct in Maria's body suddenly shifted into overdrive. Someone was in her house, a real, tangible intruder. The fear that seized her was primal and overwhelming, the kind of terror that transcends rational thought. Her mind raced through options, scenarios, possibilities, each more horrifying than the last. She had maybe 3 seconds to make a critical decision. A man appeared in the living room doorway. He was tall, muscular, with a shaved head and a face twisted with desperation and rage. He wore dark clothes and carried a crowbar in one hand. When he saw Maria, something flickered across his expression, surprise, perhaps, that someone was home. Later she would learn his name was, and he was a career criminal running from a violent felony in another state. At that moment, he was simply a terrifying stranger in her home. "Where's your money? Where's your jewelry?" he demanded, his voice harsh and commanding. His eyes were wild, unfocused. Maria would later suspect he was under the influence of drugs or alcohol or both. "Take whatever you want," Maria said, her voice somehow steady despite the trembling that had seized her entire body. "Just take it and go, please." but wasn't listening. He was moving through the house, overturning furniture, pulling drawers open, ransacking her modest possessions with violent aggression. He knocked over a framed photograph of Emma and Maria from her recent birthday party. The glass shattered across the hardwood floor. That's when Emma's cry pierced through the house, a frightened wail from upstairs. "Mama, Mama." Maria's maternal instinct overpowered her fear. She moved toward the stairs but grabbed her arm, his grip impossibly strong. "Don't move," he snarled. But Maria pulled away, driven by a force greater than any fear. She ran for the stairs while was distracted, shoving her aside as she passed. She could hear him behind her, but her focus was singular. Reach Emma, protect Emma, save Emma. She burst into Emma's bedroom to find the 3-year-old sitting up in bed, tears streaming down her face. Mr. Whiskers clutched tightly to her chest. "Mama," Emma cried out, stretching her little arms toward her mother. "It's okay, baby. It's okay," Maria whispered urgently, scooping Emma into her arms and looking around frantically. The bedroom closet, she could hide there, lock herself and Emma inside, create a barrier between her daughter and danger. But footsteps were thundering up the stairs, was coming. Maria quickly moved to the closet, an old-fashioned walk-in space with a wooden door that locked from the inside. She pulled Emma inside, whispering rapid reassurances. "Stay quiet, sweetie. We're going to play a quiet game, the quietest game ever. You're so brave. Mommy's got you." Emma, sensing her mother's fear despite the reassuring words, clung to her neck. Through the crack in the closet door, Maria could see shadows moving in her bedroom. She heard rummaging through her drawers, cursing loudly. In the distance, blessed, beautiful distance, she heard the wail of a siren. Then another. Her prayers were being answered. Someone had heard something and called the police. The sirens grew louder, closer. In the darkness of the closet, holding her trembling daughter, Maria heard the intruder's footsteps become frantic. Drawers were slammed. He was leaving. She heard him thunder down the stairs, and then the sound of breaking glass as he exited through the same back door he'd entered, mere moments before the first police car pulled up to the house. But the damage was done. Though they were physically safe, though the intruder was gone and would be apprehended 3 days later, something precious had been broken that night. Emma's sense of safety, her innocence, her ability to trust that the world was a fundamentally good place. In the weeks that followed, as Maria would desperately seek answers and support, she would discover that her daughter's trauma had manifested in a way no mother ever wants to witness. Complete, utter silence. The girl who had hummed melodies and asked her mother if she felt better would not speak again for 6 long months. The days immediately following the break-in were a blur of police reports, insurance claims, and the desperate search for normalcy that would never quite return. Detective James arrived at the home the morning after the incident, his weathered notebook already filled with preliminary details. He was a 30-year veteran of the Denver Police Department, a man who had seen humanity at both its worst and occasionally its best. But even he found something particularly disturbing about this case, the fact that a small child had been exposed to such violence, had been apprehended within 72 hours, thanks to security camera footage from a nearby convenience store and an alert patrol officer who recognized his description. He was brought into custody, booked on charges of breaking and entering, assault and terrorizing. The evidence seemed straightforward. The case appeared open and shut. But as detective conducted his interviews and gathered statements, he began to notice something troubling about little Emma's condition. Maria brought Emma to the police station for her formal interview. The little girl who had once been so talkative, so vibrant with personality, was now eerily quiet. She wore a pink dress, not her favorite, but one Maria thought might make her feel brave. Emma clung to her mother's leg, her thumb finding its way into her mouth, a regressive behavior that hadn't occurred since she was barely 2 years old. When Detective gently asked her questions, Emma's responses came in single-word whispers or complete silence, answered only by tiny nods or shakes of her head. "Do you remember the man who came into your house?" asked, his voice intentionally soft and patient. Emma's eyes filled with tears, but no words came. She buried her face in her mother's leg. Maria placed a protective hand on her daughter's back, her own voice trembling. She saw him, detective. She was awake when he came upstairs. She called for me. But Emma remained silent, locked in whatever psychological fortress her mind had constructed to protect her from the trauma. Maria took her home, hoping that time and safety would gradually coax her daughter back to speech. She was wrong. Days turned into weeks, and Emma's silence didn't diminish, it deepened. 3 weeks after the incident, Maria sat in the office of Doctor, a child psychologist specializing in trauma. Emma was in the waiting room, drawing pictures with colored pencils, one of the few forms of communication she still engaged in. Her drawings were dark and disturbing. Stick figures with exaggerated angry faces, houses with flames coming from the windows, small figures hiding in dark spaces. Doctor reviewed the images with professional concern etched across her face. "What you're describing is called selective mutism," Doctor explained, adjusting her glasses. "It's a condition where children, usually in response to severe anxiety or trauma, simply stop speaking. Emma's brain is protecting her by shutting down her ability to verbalize. It's not that she can't speak, it's that something in her neural pathways has decided that speaking isn't safe." "Will she get better?" Maria asked, her eyes searching the psychologist's face desperately. "Will she ever talk again?" "Most children do eventually," Doctor said carefully. "But it requires patience, consistent therapy, and a safe environment. Pushing her to speak will only make things worse. We need to let her come to speech on her own timeline." Maria nodded, absorbing this information, though her heart was breaking. She had always cherished her conversations with Emma, the innocent observations, the questions about why the sky was blue and where bobbies came from. The silence was a different kind of violence, a taking away that was almost as traumatic as the original incident. Meanwhile, Detective was facing his own crisis. 3 weeks into the investigation, as he prepared the case for prosecution, he learned something that made his stomach clench. Emma's silence meant no direct eyewitness testimony. Yes, had been caught at the scene. Yes, his fingerprints were all over the house. Yes, there was circumstantial evidence aplenty, but a skilled defense attorney could create reasonable doubt. And Emma, the only person who could definitively identify as the intruder, couldn't, or wouldn't, speak. Public defender, a sharp-edged woman named Jennifer, immediately seized on this vulnerability. She filed motions arguing that without a clear eyewitness identification, the evidence was insufficient for conviction. She suggested that the fingerprints could have been from a previous visit, that could claim he'd been in the home before for legitimate reasons. It was a thin argument, but in the world of criminal law, thin arguments sometimes prevailed. Spent sleepless nights reviewing the case file, frustration mounting with each passing day. He'd been a detective long enough to know that justice wasn't always a straight line. Sometimes guilty people walked free on technicalities. Sometimes the system failed the people who needed it most. He began to wonder if it would be one of those lucky ones, a dangerous predator who would slip through the cracks because a traumatized 3-year-old couldn't find her voice. 6 months after the incident, Emma's silence had become her defining characteristic. Maria had to communicate Emma's needs to teachers through written notes or quiet whispers directly to educators. Emma's preschool teachers reported that she sat alone during group activities, watching other children play with an almost haunted expression. She would occasionally smile or nod, but the joyful, outgoing child she'd been before March 15th seemed to have vanished completely. Maria began attending her own therapy sessions, wrestling with guilt that she couldn't protect her daughter from psychological damage the way she'd protected her from physical harm. Her therapist assured her that trauma couldn't be avoided through force of will, but the rational understanding did nothing to ease the emotional weight. The criminal case against had stalled. The preliminary hearing was scheduled for 6 months after the incident, and despite his protestation of innocence, the evidence seemed sufficient to proceed to trial. But Jennifer was confident in her strategy. Without Emma's testimony, without her ability to identify as the man she'd seen, conviction would be difficult. Detective sat at his desk late one night, scrolling through his email at nearly midnight when something caught his eye. It was from a colleague in another precinct, forwarding information about an experimental program, a K-9 unit specifically trained to work with traumatized children. The email was almost casual, a thought this might be interesting kind of forward. But as read the details, something inside him shifted. The program was based on the idea that certain trained dogs could help unlock communication in traumatized individuals, particularly children. It was unconventional. It was experimental. It was probably a long shot. But it was also the only shot could see remaining. He picked up his phone and began making calls, determined to find Officer Michael and learn more about the dog who might be able to do what no person had been able to accomplish. Give voice back to a silent child. Emma continued to draw her dark pictures, unaware that somewhere in the city, in police facilities and training centers, something was being set in motion that would change everything. The little girl who had been robbed of her voice by trauma would soon discover that sometimes the most unexpected connections can lead us home. Officer Michael had always possessed an intuitive understanding of dogs that seemed almost supernatural. His colleagues often joked that he could communicate with canines in a language humans weren't meant to understand. It wasn't magic, though. It was decades of dedicated study, practical experience, and a genuine love for the animals under his care. Michael had been training police dogs for 23 years, but his work with represented something different, something revolutionary that went far beyond traditional K-9 unit protocols. Was a 4-year-old German Shepherd with a lineage of exceptional working dogs. His father had been a decorated narcotics detection dog, and his mother was a search and rescue specialist. But genetic predisposition toward excellence was only part of what made him extraordinary. Michael had spent nearly 18 months in specialized training with, developing techniques and building behaviors that weren't in any standard police manual. This training was part of a groundbreaking program funded partially by federal grants and partially by donations from private citizens who believed in innovative approaches to trauma recovery. The program, officially called the Canine Companion for Traumatic Healing Initiative, operated out of a facility in North Denver. It had been running for only 4 years, and there were fewer than a dozen trained dogs in the entire United States operating under its protocols. Was considered one of the most successful dogs in the program, having already helped 14 children overcome selective mutism and another 8 adults process severe PTSD from various traumatic incidents. When Detective first reached out to Officer, the detective was careful to explain the situation without creating false hope. "I know this is experimental," said over the phone. "I know there are no guarantees, but I have a 3-year-old girl who witnessed a violent crime and she hasn't spoken in 6 months. The case against the perpetrator is falling apart because without her testimony, we don't have a solid identification. I need help. I don't know if your dog can provide it, but I'm desperate enough to try." Michael listened carefully, asking detailed questions about Emma's age, her trauma, her current behavioral patterns, and her family situation. "Bring them in," he finally said. "Let me meet the girl first. Doesn't work with every child, and I need to assess whether this is a good match before we proceed." Maria received Detective's call about the opportunity with a mixture of hope and skepticism. Hope because any possibility of helping Emma felt precious. Skepticism because it sounded almost too good to be true. A police dog could help her daughter speak again. It seemed far-fetched, like something from a movie rather than reality. But what did she have to lose? All the traditional therapy had plateaued. Emma was still drawing her dark pictures, still eating mechanically without enjoyment, still sleeping fitfully through nightmares she couldn't verbalize. The facility where Michael worked was surprisingly welcoming rather than institutional. It looked more like a comfortable ranch than a police training center, with rolling green grass, shade trees, and facilities designed to minimize stress and anxiety. When Maria and Emma arrived on a Thursday afternoon, Michael was waiting outside beside him. Emma's immediate reaction was visceral and unexpected. The moment she saw the large German shepherd, something shifted in her posture. Her rigid shoulders relaxed slightly. Her eyes, which had been dull and lifeless for months, suddenly focused with interest. She didn't speak. She hadn't spoken to anyone but her mother in whispered monosyllables in months, but the change in her physical bearing was immediately noticeable. "Emma, this is," Michael said in a soft, unhurried voice. He wasn't speaking directly to Emma in the way one might with a typical person. Instead, he was narrating, allowing the introduction to happen organically. "Is a special dog. He likes to meet new friends. Would you like to sit with?" Emma looked up at her mother, asking a question with her eyes. Maria nodded encouragement, settling onto the grass beside her daughter. Michael guided to lie down beside them, positioning the dog so he was at Emma's level but not crowding her. The dog's massive head rested on his paws, his intelligent brown eyes regarding Emma with what could only be described as gentleness. For 15 minutes, nothing much happened in the conventional sense. No dramatic breakthroughs, no sudden revelations. Emma sat quietly beside while Maria watched anxiously, but Michael knew what he was observing was significant. Emma's hand slowly extended and began stroking fur. The dog's tail thumped softly against the ground. Their breathing seemed to synchronize, the child and the animal entering into a shared rhythm that transcended verbal communication. "What you're witnessing," Michael explained quietly to Maria, "is what we call nervous system regulation. Emma's body is in a constant state of hypervigilance due to her trauma. Her sympathetic nervous system, the fight-or-flight response, is stuck in the on position. His calm presence, his steady breathing, his non-judgmental acceptance actually helps reprogram Emma's nervous system. It's not magic, it's neurobiology." "Can she help identify the man who hurt us?" Maria asked, her voice barely above a whisper. She didn't want to push Emma, but the practical concern had been weighing on her mind since the moment detective had suggested this approach. "Let's not jump ahead," Michael said gently. "Right now, we're just building trust. Emma needs to understand that is a safe presence, that she can be near another living being without fear. Once that foundation is solid, we can work on other things." Over the next 3 weeks, Maria brought Emma to the facility 3 times per week. Each session lasted about an hour, though there was no rigid structure. Michael allowed the interactions to develop naturally, resisting the urge to push or direct. Sometimes Emma and simply sat together. Other times, Emma would toss a soft toy for to retrieve, her face showing the barest hint of a smile as the dog enthusiastically returned the toy. During the 4th week, something remarkable happened. Emma had been sitting with her fingers buried in the dog's thick fur when suddenly she spoke. Not to Michael, not to her mother, but directly in a whisper so quiet it was almost inaudible, "Good boy." Maria's eyes filled with tears. It was the first time Emma had voluntarily spoken in nearly 6 months, her voice emerging not in response to direct questioning or pressure, but in a moment of genuine connection. Michael observed calmly, not making a big deal of it, understanding that acknowledging the breakthrough too enthusiastically might cause Emma to retreat back into silence. Michael began incorporating subtle therapeutic techniques into the sessions. He would speak about the incident, carefully, gently, in third-person narrative that didn't directly address Emma but created space for her to process. "Sometimes dogs have scary experiences," Michael might say while lay beside Emma. "Sometimes people feel scared. Sometimes their hearts go really fast. But learn that even after scary things, there are still good things. There's safety. There are people who care." Emma would listen silently, her fingers continuing to stroke fur. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, the tension in her small body began to decrease. The nightmares became less frequent. Her eating improved. She began playing quietly with toys again, something she hadn't done since before the incident. By the end of the 4th week, Maria noticed something she'd almost forgotten existed: Emma's laughter. It was brief and tentative, emerging when did something silly, but it was there. That precious sound of genuine joy from her daughter. Michael prepared a report for detective documenting Emma's progress. "She's not ready for formal testimony," he wrote, "but we're making remarkable strides in her willingness to communicate and her overall trauma recovery. I believe with continued sessions and with presence in the courtroom, Emma may be able to provide the identification you need. But more importantly, she's beginning to heal." Detective read the report with cautious optimism. The case might still have a chance. More importantly, Emma was getting her life back. And in Officer Michael's estimation, had found his true purpose, not in detecting drugs or finding missing persons, but in opening the door to healing for a traumatized child who had been locked inside her own silence for far too long. The County District Courthouse stood as an imposing structure of marble and granite in downtown Denver, a temple to justice that had witnessed countless human dramas unfold within its walls. On the morning of September 3rd, the building seemed to pulse with unusual energy. Word had spread through legal circles and media outlets about the unprecedented approach being taken in the case. A 3-year-old child would be giving testimony, not the remarkable part, as children occasionally, but she would be accompanied by a trained police dog specifically brought into the courtroom to facilitate her communication. It was something rarely, if ever, attempted in the state of Colorado. Detective James arrived at the courthouse at 6:47 a.m., nearly 2 hours before the proceedings were scheduled to begin. He carried 2 cups of strong black coffee and a weight of responsibility that had grown heavier with each passing day. The case against had consumed his life for the past 9 months. He'd sacrificed evenings with his own family, pursued leads that went nowhere, and fought through the bureaucratic nightmare of getting judge to approve's presence in the courtroom. Now, standing in the empty hallway outside Courtroom 5B, allowed himself a moment of doubt. What if this didn't work? What if Emma froze? What if became a distraction rather than an aid? The entire prosecution strategy now pivoted on the presence of a dog. Judge was a woman known for running her courtroom with military precision and an unwavering commitment to procedure. She had initially rejected the request to allow into the courtroom, citing her skepticism about emotional support animals and their place in serious criminal proceedings. But detective and the prosecution team had persisted, submitting research studies, expert testimony from veterinarians and trauma specialists, and ultimately, an appeal based on the unique circumstances of the case. After extensive deliberation, Judge had reluctantly granted permission, though her expression during the approval made clear her reservations. "This is highly irregular," she'd stated in her written decision. However, given the extraordinary circumstances and the vulnerability of the minor witness, the court finds that the therapeutic benefit of the canine companion may outweigh the procedural concerns. The dog will be permitted to remain with the child witness during testimony, provided that proper protocols are maintained and the dog's behavior remains controlled and professional at all times. Officer Michael arrived at the courthouse at 7:15 a.m. who seemed to sense the importance of the day. The dog wore his official K9 vest, pressed and pristine, with a special badge designating him as a certified emotional support and therapeutic assistance dog. Walked beside Michael with perfect heel positioning, his massive body moving with the grace of an athlete who had trained his entire life for moments of supreme importance. Emma and her mother arrived at 7:45 a.m., accompanied by the victim's advocate assigned to their case. Emma wore a pink dress that her mother had chosen specifically for this day, not frilly or fancy, but fresh and simple, as if nice clothes might somehow armor her against the enormity of what she was about to face. Emma's small hand was clenched tightly in her mother's grip, her eyes wide and anxious as she looked at the imposing courthouse. When Emma saw in the hallway outside the courtroom, her entire body seemed to relax. She released her mother's hand and walked toward the dog with a directness that surprised everyone present. His tail wagged gently as Emma buried her small fingers in his fur. This greeting, this moment of connection, would later be captured by a reporter's camera and become an iconic image associated with the case. A tiny child in a pink dress finding comfort and courage in the steadiness of a trained dog. "You ready?" Michael asked Emma gently, though he knew the question was really directed at both child and dog. Emma nodded and responded with a soft whine of understanding. Inside the courtroom, seats had been arranged specifically to accommodate Emma's testimony. A comfortable chair had been positioned for Emma, with additional space for to lie beside her. The judge had mandated that the arrangement be unobtrusive and not distract from the proceedings, but even so, the presence of the large German shepherd in the courtroom created an energy that was distinctly different from typical criminal trials. Sat at the defense table in an orange prison jumpsuit, his shaved head glistening under the courtroom lights. He'd been incarcerated since his arrest, bail given his status as a flight risk and a repeat offender. When he saw Emma enter the courtroom his expression flickered, surprise, perhaps, or dismissal. He'd likely assumed that a 3-year-old was beneath his concern, an unreliable witness whose testimony could be easily dismissed or discredited. The courtroom gallery was packed with journalists, legal observers, and curious citizens who had read about the case. Cameras had been positioned in the back, and several major news outlets had sent reporters to cover the proceedings. The media presence was unusual for a standard criminal case, but this was far from standard. Representatives from the American Psychological Association, the International Association of Canine Professionals, and various trauma and victim advocacy organizations had sent observers. Jennifer, public defender, sat rigidly at the defense table, her jaw clenched visibly. She'd been working the case for 9 months, building arguments about reasonable doubt and procedural inconsistencies. The presence of a police dog in the courtroom seemed to her like courtroom theater, designed to manipulate the jury's emotions rather than present evidence. She'd filed a motion to exclude just 3 days prior, arguing that the dog's presence constituted prejudicial conduct that would unfairly influence jury members' emotions. Judd had the motion, but remained convinced that the dog represented an unfair advantage to the prosecution. Maria sat in the front row of the gallery, her hands folded so tightly in her lap that her knuckles had turned white. She'd been dreading this day and anticipating it in equal measure. While Emma had made remarkable progress with help, Maria knew that testifying in front of a judge, a jury, lawyers, and reporters would be exponentially more challenging than the calm, controlled environment of Michael's training facility. The bailiff called the court to order at 9:00 a.m. precisely. Judge entered with her customary stern expression, settling into her elevated seat with the weight of her authority behind her. She looked at Emma, a small child in a pink dress sitting in an oversized courtroom chair, a large dog resting his head in her lap, and her expression softened almost imperceptibly. "We are here this morning in the case of the state of Colorado versus James," Judge announced, her voice carrying the formal cadence of hundreds of trials. "The prosecution has indicated that the victim's minor daughter will be providing testimony regarding the events of March 15th of this year. Before we proceed, I want to state for the record that this is a highly unusual proceeding. The minor witness will be accompanied by a certified emotional support and therapeutic assistance dog. The dog is present solely to facilitate the child's ability to testify, and its presence in this courtroom should not be interpreted by anyone as prejudicial to either the defense or the prosecution." She turned her attention to Emma, her expression gentler than anyone in the courtroom had ever seen Judge's face become. "Emma, do you understand that you need to tell the truth today?" Emma looked up at the judge, her small voice barely audible. "Yes." It was the third voluntary word Emma had spoken in the entire 9 months since the incident. And as that single word echoed through the courtroom, a word spoken not in the safety of Michael's facility or the privacy of her home, but in front of strangers and cameras, and the man who had terrified her. Something shifted in the energy of the room. The trial was about to begin. The courtroom fell silent as Emma's single word "yes" hung in the air like a promise being made to the universe. Prosecutor, a sharp-minded woman in her mid-40s with a reputation for meticulous case preparation, rose from her chair with measured deliberation. She had spent months preparing for this moment, consulting with child psychologists, trauma specialists, and Emma's own therapist. She understood the delicate balance required. Ask enough questions to establish credibility, but not so many that the child became overwhelmed or retreated back into silence. Emma began, her voice carefully modulated to a gentle warmth that was genuine rather than performative. "I'm going to ask you some questions. You can answer with words, or you can just nod or shake your head. It's okay either way, and if you need to take a break, we can always stop. Is that okay?" Emma looked at, who had shifted his massive head to look up at her with those intelligent brown eyes. The dog's presence seemed to anchor her to the present moment, to remind her that she was safe even in this enormous, intimidating space. She nodded once, a small movement but visible to everyone in the courtroom. "Thank you, Emma. I appreciate your bravery," said, and she genuinely meant it. "Can you tell me about your home, the home where you live with your mommy?" The question was deliberately simple, designed to allow Emma to ease into communication without the immediate pressure of discussing the traumatic event. For a long moment, nothing happened. Emma's fingers continued stroking fur, and her eyes seemed to be looking at something far away, something from her past. Then, in a voice so quiet that Judge had to lean forward slightly to hear, Emma spoke. "It's pretty." The words, simple as they were, seemed to reverberate through the courtroom with extraordinary power. Several jury members' faces softened visibly. One woman, seated in the third row of the jury box, actually wiped away a tear. In 9 months, the child had barely spoken to anyone. And now, in a courtroom filled with strangers, with her alleged attacker present just yards away, she was finding words. "It's pretty," repeated, affirming Emma's contribution. "What makes it pretty?" "Has flowers," Emma continued, her confidence building incrementally with each word. "Backyard, and Mama's kitchen is yellow." His tail thumped gently against the courtroom floor, a soft sound that seemed to encourage Emma forward. Michael, positioned discreetly to the side of the courtroom, made careful notes. This was crucial. Emma wasn't just speaking. She was remembering specific details, contextualizing her home in her own mind. The trauma specialist had explained that once a traumatized child began speaking, the narrative often flowed, the memories unlocking like a chain of dominoes falling in sequence. Continued with careful questions, establishing a foundation of normalcy before approaching the incident itself. "Do you like your backyard, Emma?" "Yes," Emma said, and then, unprompted, she added more. "I play there with Mr. Whiskers." "Mr. Whiskers is a friend." "Stuffed rabbit," Emma clarified, her vocabulary expanding as her confidence grew. "I love him." Shifted in his chair at the defense table, a gesture of dismissal. His attorney, Jennifer, placed a restraining hand on his arm, a silent warning to remain still and composed. But's own expression showed growing concern. The narrative Emma was establishing wasn't just testimony. It was a portrait of an innocent child whose life had been disrupted by violence. Over the next 20 minutes, guided Emma through the evening of March 15th. The questions came slowly, patiently, allowing Emma to construct her own narrative rather than having it imposed upon her. Emma spoke about dinner, chicken and rice, her favorite. She talked about her bath time and her bedtime routine. The jury watched, mesmerized, as a 3-year-old girl recounted the ordinary events of an ordinary evening, events that had been shattered by extraordinary violence. Then asked the transitional question, "After you went to bed, what happened?" Emma's hand stilled on fur. Her entire body seemed to tense. Sensing her distress, moved closer, pressing more firmly against her leg, applying pressure that child psychologists had identified as incredibly grounding for traumatized individuals. action was not accidental or random. It was the result of months of specific training designed to respond to Emma's physiological stress signals. There was a sound, Emma said, and her voice had changed. It was thinner now, more strained, breaking like glass. "What did you do when you heard that sound?" "I got scared," Emma whispered. "I called for Mama." Paused, giving Emma space to breathe, to process. The defense attorney considered objecting, considered arguing that the questions were leading or traumatizing the witness, but she knew that any objection would appear cruel and calculated to the jury. Instead, she sat silently, watching her case crumble. "Your mommy came to you?" "Yes, she came fast. She was scared too. I could feel her scared." Emma's eyes filled with tears, but she didn't stop speaking. This was crucial. The trauma wasn't flowing back into silence. It was being verbalized, processed, transformed from a thing she carried internally into something that could be externalized and examined. "Emma, did someone else come into your room that night? Someone other than your mommy?" The entire courtroom seemed to hold its breath. This was the precipice, the moment before the identification that could determine the case's outcome. Emma looked directly at, and the dog responded by resting his chin more firmly on her lap, a gesture of absolute support and safety. "A man," Emma said, her voice becoming even quieter. "He was angry, his face was mean." "Do you see that man in this courtroom right now, Emma?" His voice was gentle but purposeful. This was the essential question, the one that had been impossible to ask until had unlocked Emma's ability to communicate. Emma's eyes moved away for the first time since she'd taken the stand. Her gaze traveled across the courtroom, past the jury box, past Michael and detective, until it landed on sitting at the defense table. The courtroom was absolutely silent. Even the ambient sounds of the building, the HVAC system, distant hallway conversations, seemed to fade away. Judge sat motionless in her elevated seat. The jury members leaned forward almost imperceptibly. Jennifer's face had gone pale. Emma pointed directly at, her small finger extending across the empty space like an accusation written in flesh and bone. "That's the man," Emma said, her voice gaining strength from some deep internal wellspring. "That's the man who came in my room." Face contorted, his careful composure finally cracking. He began to say something, but his attorney grabbed his arm urgently, silencing him. The gallery erupted in a cacophony of whispers and gasps. Judge's gavel came down sharply, demanding order. But the crucial moment had passed. Emma had spoken. She had looked directly at her alleged attacker and identified him with absolute clarity. The identification was powerful not because of legal procedure or forensic evidence, but because of the raw, unmistakable truth in a child's voice, a voice that had been silent for 9 months and had now been reclaimed. Who had remained completely still and focused throughout Emma's testimony, finally shifted, allowing his massive body to relax. His job, to provide the bridge back to communication for a traumatized child, had been accomplished. As Emma dissolved into tears in her mother's arms during a brief recess, with his head resting gently on her legs, the courtroom's energy had fundamentally transformed. Justice, it seemed, had found its voice in the words of a 3-year-old girl and the steadfast presence of a dog who asked nothing but to be present. The moment seemed to expand and contract simultaneously, becoming both instantaneous and eternal. Emma's small finger remained extended, unwavering, pointed directly at with the unambiguous clarity of absolute truth. The 2 words she spoke, "that man," were simple in their linguistic construction but seismic in their impact. They reverberated through the courtroom like a bell struck at precisely the right frequency to shatter glass. Judge, a woman who had presided over hundreds of trials and prided herself on maintaining emotional neutrality, felt something shift in her chest. She had entered this case with considerable skepticism about the unconventional approach, worried about courtroom theatrics and questionable methodology. But what she was witnessing transcended procedural concerns. She was observing truth in its form, a child's direct identification of the man who had violated her sanctuary and shattered her innocence. Reaction was immediate and visceral. His carefully constructed facade crumbled like ancient stone exposed to sudden force. His face flushed a deep crimson, his jaw clenched so tightly that the muscles around his temples visibly pulsed. He began to rise from his seat, his mouth opening as if to speak, perhaps to deny or threaten or intimidate. But Jennifer, his public defender, moved with the urgency of someone who understood exactly what was at stake. Her hand shot out, gripping his arm with surprising strength for her slight frame. "Don't," she hissed, her voice barely audible but carrying the weight of legal warning. "Sit down, now." But the rage in his eyes had become a living, palpable thing. His attorney leaned close to him, whispering rapid counsel. Whatever she said seemed to penetrate his rage-induced haze because his expression shifted from explosive anger to calculated control, though the effort required was visible in every tensed muscle of his body. The gallery erupted. Journalists who had been quietly taking notes suddenly began typing frantically on their laptops. Cameras flashed despite judge standing orders forbidding photography during proceedings. Spectators leaned toward one another, whispering urgently. Several people had recording devices out, capturing audio of what they understood they were witnessing. A pivotal moment in a case that would likely be discussed in legal and psychological circles for years. Judge's gavel came down with sharp authority. "Order! I will clear this courtroom if necessary. Bailiff, secure the gallery." The courtroom's energy settled into a tense, controlled silence, though the electricity in the air remained unmistakable. Every eye was on Emma, who sat in her oversized chair, her small frame somehow appearing both incredibly vulnerable and possessed of extraordinary strength. Remained absolutely still, his massive body providing physical grounding, his presence a testament to the reality that she was safe. Maria, watching from the front row of the gallery, had tears streaming down her face. These weren't the tears of someone who had been victimized, though she had been. These were tears of witnessing her daughter reclaim her voice, of seeing her child transform from a silent victim into a witness capable of speaking truth. She reached forward, placing her hand against the railing that separated the gallery from the courtroom proper, a gesture that seemed to reach across space toward her daughter. The prosecutor allowed a moment of silence to settle before proceeding. This was crucial. Rushing forward would diminish the power of what had just transpired. Instead, she simply looked at Emma with an expression of profound respect and said, "Thank you, Emma. You are very brave." Emma's chin trembled. She looked at, and the dog responded by shifting his position slightly, providing even more contact and support. The dog seemed to understand, with an intuition that transcended training protocols, that Emma needed physical reassurance following the intensity of her identification. Jennifer stood slowly, her mind racing through legal options and strategic considerations. She had several choices. She could ask for a brief recess to confer with her client about how to proceed. She could attempt an aggressive cross-examination designed to discredit Emma's identification. Or she could try to minimize the damage through careful questioning that might introduce elements of doubt without appearing cruel. "I need to approach the bench," she said, signaling her intention to speak with the judge privately. Judge nodded, and both attorneys approached the elevated judge's seat. What followed was a heated but whispered conversation, inaudible to the courtroom gallery, in which objected to the reliability of Emma's identification, argued that her testimony had been compromised by the emotional support provided by, and suggested that the entire proceeding had been designed to manipulate rather than illuminate. Judge listened without visible reaction, then spoke with quiet authority. "Counsel, the child has made a clear, direct identification. Whether or not you agree with the methodology that brought her to the point of being able to testify, her identification is now part of the evidentiary record. You are free to cross-examine, but I will not allow you to traumatize a 3-year-old witness based on your objections to our courtroom procedures. Proceed carefully, Ms." returned to her position at the defense table, her face flushed with frustration. She understood that she was in a nearly impossible position. Any aggressive questioning of a 3-year-old girl who had just overcome selective mutism to identify her alleged attacker would play terribly with the jury. The public narrative was already being written, a traumatized child who had found her voice through an innovative therapeutic approach. Attacking that narrative directly would be strategic suicide. She decided on a different approach, minimal questioning, designed to establish doubt about identification reliability without appearing callous. "Emma," she began, her voice intentionally softer than her usual courtroom demeanor, "when this man came into your room that night, how much light was there? Could you see him clearly?" It was a smart question, designed to introduce reasonable doubt about visual identification. But Emma's response was immediate and certain. "Pink, I could see." Was there anything about that night that was confusing? Anything that scared you so much that maybe your memory isn't quite right? "He was there," Emma said simply, with the absolute certainty of a child who had witnessed something her entire being registered as true. "I remember." Tried a few more variations of similar questions, but each time Emma answered with the same clear, unwavering certainty. The jury's expressions made clear that they understood what was happening. The defense was attempting to undermine the identification, but in doing so, they were only reinforcing its credibility. Emma's consistency, her calm certainty, her lack of equivocation, all of these factors suggested not a confused child manufacturing memories, but a child stating simple, fundamental truth. Detectives sat perfectly still in the gallery, barely daring to breathe. 6 months of investigation, 9 months of waiting, and now, in the span of a single child's testimony, the case had been transformed from something fragile and uncertain into something solid and undeniable. Officer Michael watched with pride and something deeper, perhaps the satisfaction of witnessing his years of dedication and training serve its highest purpose. The dog had been a bridge back to voice, a pathway through trauma to truth-telling. His presence hadn't created Emma's memories. It had simply allowed the memories that were already there to be spoken aloud. As concluded her examination and Jennifer completed her cross-examination, Emma was finally allowed to step down. Maria hurried from the gallery, and Judge, in an extraordinary breach of courtroom formality, allowed the mother to embrace her daughter in the witness box area before they were escorted from the courtroom. Emma held tightly to his collar as she walked, and the dog maintained his calm demeanor despite the unusual circumstances. The gallery erupted again the moment Emma and Maria left the courtroom. Journalists rushed toward the exits, eager to report on what had just transpired. Sat at the defense table, his earlier rage replaced by the hollow expression of someone who understood that his carefully constructed lies had been decimated by the simple truth spoken from a child's lips. In that single moment, when Emma pointed and spoke 2 words, something fundamental had shifted. The trial was far from over, but everyone present understood that the verdict had essentially been decided. Justice had found its voice, and it spoke in the words of a 3-year-old girl who refused to remain silent any longer. The 3 days following Emma's testimony felt suspended in time, existing in a strange liminal space between the event itself and its resolution. The trial continued with additional witnesses, detective presenting forensic evidence, establishing the timeline of events, corroborating Emma's narrative with physical documentation. But everyone involved understood that the trial had essentially been decided the moment Emma pointed at and spoke 2 words with absolute clarity. On the 3rd day after Emma's testimony stood to deliver the prosecution's closing argument. She was a skilled orator, but she understood that eloquence wasn't required in this case. The facts spoke loudly enough. Instead, she chose to honor Emma's contribution with restraint and dignity. "Members of the jury," she began, "you have heard testimony from a 3-year-old child. A child who 9 months ago could not speak about what happened to her. A child whose trauma was so profound that she fell silent. A silence that lasted through holidays, through seasons changing, through the very fabric of her young life being altered. And yet, when given the proper support and the safety to do so, that child found her voice. That child looked directly at the man who violated her home and her sense of security, and she identified him with absolute certainty. She paused, letting the weight of Emma's testimony settle over the jury box. The defendant would have you believe that a 3-year-old's identification is unreliable, that the presence of a dog somehow corrupted the testimony, that reasonable doubt exists. But I would ask you, what is more reliable than a child who has no reason to lie, who has nothing to gain by testifying, who overcame unimaginable psychological barriers to speak truth? She presented the forensic evidence methodically, fingerprints matching, fibers from his clothing found in the home, the crowbar recovered from his possession matching the tool used to break the back door. But she kept returning to Emma's testimony, not because it was the strongest evidence, but because it was the most human evidence. It was the voice of innocence speaking against cruelty. Jennifer's closing argument was in legal desperation. She attacked the methodology, the dog, the judge's decision to allow this unconventional proceeding. She questioned the reliability of a child's memory, the suggestibility of young witnesses, the potential for false identification. She presented alternative scenarios, however implausible. She invoked the jury's duty to presume innocence and to demand proof beyond reasonable doubt. But the jury had watched Emma testify. They had seen presence provide comfort without coaching. They had observed the absolute certainty with which a traumatized child had identified her attacker. No amount of legal argument could overcome what they had witnessed firsthand. The jury was sent to deliberate at 2:47 p.m. on a Thursday. The courtroom cleared into a tense waiting period that would stretch for 19 hours, was returned to his cell. Jennifer met with her investigators to discuss appellate strategies. Maria sat in a waiting area provided by the victim's advocate, holding Emma, who had returned to relative muteness following her extraordinary testimony. The psychological toll of speaking about trauma in such a public, formal setting had left Emma depleted. Officer Michael arrived at the courthouse at 8:00 a.m. the following day, bringing with him. Emma's face transformed when she saw the dog, the first genuine smile anyone had seen since her testimony, seemed to sense that Emma needed his presence not as a therapeutic tool but simply as a friend. He rested his massive head on her lap, and she stroked his ears, drawing comfort from his steady, dependable presence. At 11:23 a.m., the jury sent word that they had reached a verdict. The courtroom filled rapidly. Journalists, legal observers, family members, and the curious general public who had been following the case. Was brought from the holding area, his expression unreadable, a mask of practiced indifference that couldn't quite hide the tension visible in his clenched jaw. Judge entered to silence. The gallery rose. The foreman stood when instructed, a middle-aged man with kind eyes who had been elected to speak for the jury's collective conscience. On the count of breaking and entering, how do you find the defendant? Judge asked, her voice carrying the formal cadence of hundreds of trials. Guilty, the foreman said clearly. On the count of aggravated assault, how do you find the defendant? Guilty. On the count of terrorizing, how do you find the defendant? Guilty. The courtroom erupted. Maria gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Detective closed his eyes, the tension that had been building for 9 months finally releasing. Officer placed a gentle hand on his head, acknowledging the dog's role in this moment. Several jury members had tears in their eyes, not from sadness, but from the cathartic release of witnessing justice served. Expression finally cracked. The mask of indifference shattered. His face contorted into an expression of rage and disbelief, as if the verdict were incomprehensible, as if the legal system had somehow conspired against him unfairly. His attorney placed a restraining hand on his arm, silencing any outburst before it could begin. Judge gavelled for order, her own expression revealing more emotion than she typically displayed. "The defendant will be remanded to custody pending sentencing," she announced. "Sentencing will occur in 30 days. Bailiff, secure the defendant." As was led from the courtroom, still struggling against the injustice he felt, a man who had committed a violent crime now outraged that the legal system had held him accountable, Emma began to cry. Not tears of fear, but tears of release. Her mother held her close and pressed against them both, the three of them creating a moment of sanctuary within the formal courtroom space. After the jury was dismissed, Judge did something extraordinary. She called the prosecutor and defense counsel to her bench, but more significantly, she asked that Emma and her mother approach. In a courtroom packed with observers, the judge looked directly at Emma. "Young lady," Judge said, her stern expression softening into something approaching gentleness, "I want you to know that what you did today took remarkable courage. You were brave, and you told the truth. This court is grateful for your testimony, and I hope that you will heal and grow and become an even stronger person because of what you endured and what you overcame." Emma looked up at the judge, her eyes still wet with tears, and nodded. Officer Michael was approached by representatives from multiple law enforcement agencies. The head of the Colorado Bureau of Investigation wanted to discuss expanding the K-9 trauma program. A representative from the American Psychological Association requested permission to interview about his methodology for possible publication in professional journals. News outlets competed for exclusive interviews, sensing that this case represented a turning point in how the justice system approached vulnerable witnesses. Detective knelt down to Emma's level. "Thank you," he said simply. "You did good, you did really good." Emma reached out and hugged him, a gesture that spoke volumes about the transformation that had occurred. From a traumatized child unable to communicate to a child who could connect with others, who could express gratitude and accept comfort. Received a sentence of 12 years for the charges he'd been convicted of, with an additional 5 years for a prior conviction that was now being considered as part of his sentencing package. He would likely spend the majority of his remaining productive years incarcerated. But the verdict wasn't really about any more. It was about Emma, about a child who had found her voice when everything in her traumatized mind told her that speaking was dangerous. It was about whose steady presence had provided the bridge back to communication. It was about a justice system willing to innovate, to try unconventional approaches when conventional methods failed. In the weeks following the trial, as journalists continued to report on the case and legal scholars analyzed its implications, Emma began the long process of genuine healing. She still had nightmares sometimes. She still startled at sudden loud noises. She still required ongoing therapy and support. But she was speaking, laughing, playing, and growing. Justice had prevailed. More importantly, a child had prevailed. 6 months after received his sentence, the story of Emma and had transcended the boundaries of a single criminal case and become a national phenomenon. The V trial was featured in legal journals, psychology textbooks, and documentary films. Major news networks ran in-depth segments. True crime podcasts devoted entire episodes to analyzing how a 3-year-old girl's testimony and an innovative K-9 program had fundamentally altered the landscape of victim advocacy and trauma-informed justice. Emma was now 7 years old, a first grader at Lakewood Elementary School who was thriving in ways that once seemed impossible. The little girl who had been locked in silence for 9 months was now talkative, engaged, and possessed of a resilience that impressed her teachers. She had become something of a local celebrity in a way that was both blessing and challenge. Well-meaning adults frequently approached her with recognition and praise, which Emma accepted with the polite grace her mother had taught her, though Maria worried about the weight of being defined by her trauma. Emma continued to meet with Dr. Sarah Mitchell, her trauma specialist, twice weekly. These sessions were no longer focused on processing the incident itself, but rather on building tools for managing the ongoing effects of trauma, the occasional nightmares, the startled responses to loud noises, the moments when her nervous system would suddenly shift into high alert without obvious trigger. Attended these sessions faithfully, no longer as a therapeutic tool specifically trained to unlock communication, but simply as a constant, devoted presence that seemed to understand Emma's emotional landscape in ways that transcended training or protocol. Officer Michael had become something of a celebrity within law enforcement circles. He had received commendations from the Denver Police Department, the Colorado Bureau of Investigation, and even a personal letter of recognition from the U.S. Attorney General. Universities invited him to speak about his innovative approach to K-9 training. The K-9 Companion for Traumatic Healing Initiative, the program that had trained, suddenly had enormous funding and institutional support. Within 18 months of Emma's trial, the program had expanded to include training facilities in 12 states. 23 new dogs were in advanced training, with dozens more in preliminary stages. Officer found himself transitioning from hands-on dog training to program development, curriculum design, and training other handlers who shared his vision of using carefully selected and trained dogs to bridge the communication gap for traumatized individuals. The science was always there, explained in a presentation to law enforcement officers from across the country. We understand that trauma literally rewires the brain's communication pathways. We know that a child's fight-or-flight response can become stuck in the on position. What we've learned from Emma's case is that sometimes the most powerful tool for healing isn't more words or more pressure or more traditional therapy. Sometimes it's the presence of a being who asks nothing but offers everything: safety, consistency, non-judgment, and unconditional acceptance. Detective James retired from active duty 18 months after the trial concluded, though his retirement was far from quiet. He became a consultant for the newly expanded K-9 trauma program, helping law enforcement agencies across the country develop protocols for introducing therapy dogs into courtroom settings. He worked with judges to create legal frameworks that protected the rights of defendants while acknowledging the therapeutic needs of traumatized witnesses. His expertise became invaluable in navigating the complex intersection of criminal procedure, animal welfare, and trauma psychology. Maria's journey took her in a direction she had never anticipated. Watching her daughter heal and witnessing the broader impact of that healing ripple through the criminal justice system inspired her to transform her own trauma into purpose. She founded Voices Through Love, a nonprofit organization dedicated to supporting trauma survivors and advocating for innovative therapeutic approaches. The organization's mission statement became "Giving voice to the voiceless, healing the broken, transforming justice through compassion." The nonprofit grew rapidly. Within 2 years, it had a staff of 12 full-time employees and a network of volunteer advocates across Colorado. It provided free trauma counseling to survivors of violent crimes, trained other parents to recognize signs of trauma in their children, and worked with schools to create trauma-informed educational environments. Maria brought Officer onto the board of directors, and together they began developing programs that brought trained K-9 teams into schools, community centers, and victim advocacy organizations. What Emma experienced was the worst thing that has happened to her, Maria explained during a fundraising event. But her voice, her courage, her willingness to speak truth despite her terror, that became the catalyst for system-wide change. Every child who benefits from the expanded K-9 trauma program, every victim who can now testify in court with the support of a trained dog, every community that has been transformed by innovative trauma-informed justice, all of that flows from Emma's bravery and the vision of people like Officer who believed there had to be a better way. The impact extended into the courtroom itself. Within 3 years of Emma's trial, Over 40 child witnesses across the United States had in criminal proceedings with the support of trained K9 therapy dogs. The conviction rates in cases involving child witnesses increased significantly. Prosecutors reported that judges and juries were more receptive to child testimony when it was accompanied by the presence of a trained emotional support animal. Defense attorneys, initially skeptical, began recognizing that the dogs actually enhanced rather than undermined the credibility of testimony, because the presence of the dogs seemed to ground witnesses and reduce the likelihood of inconsistency. Emma herself became an advocate, though in age-appropriate ways. At 7 years old, she began visiting schools throughout Colorado, accompanied always to speak to other children about resilience, courage, and the importance of asking for help. Her message was simple and profound. I couldn't talk for a long time because I was scared, but then I had and helped me know I was safe. And then I could talk. And when I talked, the bad man couldn't hurt people anymore. You can talk too. Even if you're scared, you can tell someone you trust, and they can help you. Children responded to Emma in ways that adults recognized as profound. When a 7-year-old who had survived violence stood before them and spoke about her own survival, it somehow made the possibility of their own recovery feel more tangible, more achievable. Dr. Sarah Mitchell published a groundbreaking paper in the American Journal of Trauma Psychology titled Nervous System Regulation and Canine-Assisted Communication in Pediatric Trauma Recovery: The Case and Beyond. The paper examined the neurobiological mechanisms through which trained dogs facilitated communication in traumatized children and proposed frameworks for integrating K9 therapy into standard trauma treatment protocols. Now in his 8th year, had become something of a legend within law enforcement circles. He was featured in recruiting materials for the Denver Police Department and was the subject of multiple children's books about a dog who helped a girl find her voice. Despite his celebrity status, remained remarkably grounded, seemingly unbothered by his notoriety. He was happiest simply being present, in Emma's home during quiet evenings, at the facility where new K9 candidates were trained, or in courtrooms across the country where other traumatized children found courage in his presence. The case had become a template for innovation in the criminal justice system. Legal scholars referenced it when arguing for more flexible, trauma-informed courtroom procedures. Psychology programs incorporated it into curricula about trauma recovery. Animal-assisted therapy programs pointed to it as evidence of the profound healing potential of human-animal partnerships. But perhaps most importantly, Emma had healed. The little girl who had been robbed of her voice had reclaimed it. The trauma remained part of her history, but it no longer defined her future. She had become a symbol not just of survival but of transformation, of the possibility of turning pain into purpose, silence into voice, victimization into advocacy. In quiet moments, watching Emma play in her backyard watching her laugh with genuine joy, watching her grow into a confident, articulate, resilient young girl, Maria understood the true victory. It wasn't the conviction. It wasn't the systemic change. It wasn't the expanded programs or the recognition or the legacy. The true victory was her daughter's life, restored, healed, and filled with possibility. The journey from silence to voice had been extraordinary, but the journey from victim to victor, from trauma to healing, from brokenness to wholeness, that was the real miracle. And it had begun with 2 words spoken with absolute certainty and the steady presence of a dog who believed in the power of simply being there.